Good morning. My name is Sarisha Gunta. I'm an attorney with the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. Thank you for joining us in this installment of our monthly webcast series. And we apologize for the technical delays, but we appreciate your patience and for hanging out to listen to this interesting topic, avoiding fraud and cyber risk from inside and outside your nonprofit. We're really excited to have John Horn and Anush Emelianova from Key & Spalding here with us this morning to speak to us about this topic. Before they jump into the substance, I'd like to tell you a little more about Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. Our mission is to provide free legal services to community-based nonprofits that serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals. We do this by matching eligible organizations with volunteer attorneys from leading corporations and law firms in Atlanta to assist those nonprofits with their business law matters. Our clients are 501c3 nonprofits located or serving the greater Atlanta area, serving low income and disadvantaged individuals, and these nonprofits are otherwise unable to afford legal services. If you're interested in applying to be a client, please visit our website. And also at our website, you'll find a wealth of resources, including articles, past webcasts, and in a few days, this webcast will also be posted on our website. And a legal disclaimer, please keep in mind that the information that John and Anush will be sharing with you today is just general advice. If you have specific questions about your organization, reach out to your PBPA attorney. Thank you, and now I'll turn the mic over to you guys.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here with you this morning, and we certainly thank the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta for inviting us to spend some time with you this morning. The genesis of our presentation began a few months ago when the Executive Director Extraordinaire of Pro Bono Partnership here in Atlanta, Rachel Spears, called me regarding several of the organizations under the umbrella here that had experienced some unfortunate experiences with fraud schemes, and we talked about the things that they had encountered. We talked about the money that they had lost. We talked about what options were available to them, and in piecing through the experiences that they were encountering, we realized that the types of fraudulent activities and fraud schemes that are so ubiquitous outside the nonprofit world are as present and active in the nonprofit world, and are creating potential problems, and people need to be aware of them, and they need to know how to, as much as possible, prevent them and how to respond when they occur. You know, the reality is that ever since time immemorial, when people began to accumulate money, accumulate wealth, as much as people work hard to do that, there's always going to be another person or group of people that are going to work just as hard to either lie, cheat, deceive, or spend a tremendous amount of resources to try to take that money away. And that has been the case whether on the individual side, but particularly present on the business side, on the corporate side. And what we are seeing these days is that as companies and business moves to the new platform, which is the internet, web-based commerce, that is where fraud and fraud schemes are following the money to take place. And we have seen a lot of patterns that we will talk about today of fraud schemes that are now very present, very popular, very frequently replicated on the internet to try to help to make people in the nonprofit world more aware so that they can try to put together whatever policies and procedures to minimize the risk that they will become victims of this. And of course, the last piece that we will talk about is things that are not web-based, things that are not on the internet in particular, and unfortunately, people within the organization, and how to protect yourself from the very unfortunate circumstances when somebody within the organization decides to try to steal money from your group. So that's our plan, again, to talk about these schemes, to talk about ways you can protect yourself and what you should do if you become a victim of these schemes. So I'm going to turn things over to Anush, and Anush will talk a little bit about fraud schemes in the nonprofit world. So take it away, Anush.
Sure. So the answer to the question on the previous slide, why worry about fraud, is that nonprofits are being increasingly targeted for fraudulent schemes and cybercrime. You would think that your humanitarian mission and the fact that you're a nonprofit would insulate you, but in fact, cybercrime is increasing every year, and there are more and more cyber criminals every year, and as a result, they're casting a wider net, and we're seeing that more nonprofits are being targeted for schemes like this. We don't have a clear picture of exactly how much fraud there is because many incidents go unreported, and it's certainly not necessarily in the interest of an organization to suffer the reputational costs of saying we were the victim of a breach or a business email compromise. But we do have some information. One Nigeria-based scam ring, Scarlet Widow, is notable because they previously did romance scams, meaning they catfished people. They pretended to be someone on the internet who would pretend to have a romantic interest in you and then would ask you for money. But recently they've shifted their focus and they're now specializing in nonprofits. And this is probably just one cyber criminal organization that does this. It just happens to be one that some cyber researchers managed to get some insight into, so they were able to gather a fair amount of information. But what's interesting about Scarlet Widow is just the sheer scale of its operation. It has gathered information on at least 30,000 individuals in just the year and a half that they were being observed by the research organization. And as we'll discuss a bit later, they've been using that information to send emails and try to compromise nonprofit organizations. And they've really specialized in nonprofits in order to make it more convincing when they are trying to pursue a fraudulent scheme. Some of their larger, bigger name targets are the Boy Scouts and the Salvation Army, but of course, with 13,000 organizations, most of which are in the United States, that goes all the way down to even the smallest nonprofits. So why are nonprofits attractive targets? Part of that is that they're perceived as softer targets by cyber criminals. We've concluded some statistics here about the kinds of policies that nonprofits tend not to have spent the resources to get. These policies, a general cybersecurity risk policy and an incident response policy, isn't exactly what you would need to protect against business email compromise. We'll get into that a little later. But those policies do tend to be indicative of a sophisticated cybercrime program and a lot of resources to spend on cybercrime risk. The good news is that cybersecurity training and the kinds of things we'll talk about today don't necessarily have to take up a lot of resources, and they can prevent some negative effects. On one of the previous slides, we mentioned Utah Food Bank. That was obviously a well-known food bank that ended up having 10,000 donors' personal information stolen from their website because their website was compromised. As a result, they had to notify all those donors about the breach of personal information. They had to provide a year of credit monitoring. That is just, to demonstrate that this is something that should be a priority, because you certainly don't want to discourage donations by having a publicized data breach or a business email compromise that could compromise the reputation of your nonprofit and distract from your important mission.
And as we have put our presentation together, we're obviously trying to pick out some examples of specific cases that we think will help to illustrate the points that we're making today. If you have any questions during the course of the presentation, please feel free to type them in. We will be glad to interrupt if it's something that we would like to cover right away. Also, we'll try to save some time for questions at the end, but we do encourage this to be as much of a dialogue via the webcast that we can. As Anush was mentioning, nonprofits are becoming more and more of a targeted entity in the fraud space. And we thought it might be helpful to look a little bit at what kind of risk factors you might have with your organization to identify you as an organization that's a potential fraud victim. Really, the way that fraudsters work, it's the bigger the blanket, the bigger the scope, the better. They will really cast as wide a net as they possibly can, and there's a lot of randomness to it, which is unfortunate. Beyond that, if you're pro bono, if your nonprofit has funds, if you have bank accounts, if you store money in those bank accounts, if you raise money through fundraising, and that is something that is active and present publicly with your organization, that potentially could draw more attention within the fraud community to make you a more attractive target. if you're doing electronic transactions, if you're doing donations over the net through websites, if you're taking credit cards, again, these are the kinds of things that are very present in the fraud community, the cybercrime community. So the more touchings that you have electronically, the more criminal syndicates that are operating overseas, whether in Russia or in Eastern Europe, they are more have more access to your organization through your electronic footprint. So then the other question is sort of what sort of assets is it that your nonprofit can have? If you think about a large corporation, they can have intellectual property, they can have trade secrets, they can have large lists of customers that have personal information and addresses and social security numbers, things like that. If those are the kinds of things that you have started to collect and store by your organization, if you are collecting and storing large amounts of data, if you have large donor lists, again, no size, while as much as this is sort of a bad news, and it's not always going to be bad news webcast, size in some respects really doesn't matter. If you have some of these things that are stored and available, there will be people, whoever it is, that will spend time to either try to get into your network or, as some of the other ways that we'll talk about today, access your information and steal it.
I have a question. If you're using a third party to take donations for your nonprofit, and then that third party is breached, how would that affect the nonprofit? Would their name be publicized as well?
So this is a cutting edge area in cyber law and privacy law. An organization is responsible for the vendors that it contracts with. And so if you have a vendor that you are paying or that you are using to process your financial transactions, it is your responsibility to make sure that that vendor has sufficient cybersecurity and defenses, and that's should be part of the contractual process. You can contract in a way that secures or safeguards you and make sure that the burden of the cybersecurity is on the vendor. There may be an obligation that you have to do audits depending upon how you do the contract. So if the information is stolen from that vendor, if the information belongs to you, if you're the organization and they're simply processing it for you, you still may have obligations in terms of notification or just in the public perception, the fact that the vendor, it may have happened on the vendor's footprint, it's still going to be your organization's name in the news. So it's kind of a complicated question, but again, these are things that you need to be talking about with your vendors, having in your contractual provisions, and then if necessary, auditing and asking, making sure that they do have sufficient cybersecururity. Do you have any thoughts on that, Anish?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think if it's a larger vendor, like if you're working with PayPal, and there is a breach, then the consumer might not be that surprised if they're receiving a letter directly from PayPal. And if it's sufficiently large, then probably the news are going to be reporting about the vendor and not you. If it's a smaller vendor and you're a more well-known nonprofit and the donors gave their information to you, then they would generally expect to receive that letter from you. We generally advise that it's a name that the customers have seen before that we put on the communications to customers.
Yeah, and let's be real. I mean, if you're a organization that has a smaller annual revenue and 20 employees, PayPal's not necessarily going to alter their terms and conditions in its contract with you. You may not have that same level of leverage, and we're seeing that with these large third-party intermediaries. They don't want to change the way that they're, but you can ask the question. You can make sure that your contract has the provisions in it that memorialize the fact that PayPal is implementing adequate security and taking adequate measures to protect privacy and the information and things like that. So again, great question to talk to your counsel about and spend more time on, because it is something you should be spending time on. One thing that we thought we would do today to help to illustrate is to look at sort of case studies of some of the present things that are happening in the fraud world, the corporate fraud world, and see if they analogize to the nonprofit world and sort of use that as a leaping pad to talk about fraud concepts more generally. And the one example that is ubiquitous at the moment, and it's surprising to me because this is something that really is the revival fraud schemes that predates the internet. This is and then became real popular with the Nigerian prince scams that you would get through emails years ago. These are what are called business email compromise schemes, and it's a term that can be applied very broadly, and Anish will talk about some of the different variations of it and how it works. But the bottom line is, if the email is a way that people are reaching out and contacting your organizations, and through these emails there are very innovative, thoughtful, sophisticated, concerted, long-term campaigns to try to get into your organization and get to the money. And the increase, what the FBI has been seeing in this activity, is absolutely through the roof. It was years ago, last few years, it's been ransomware, and ransomware kind of took a little downward dip. And when it did, it seemed that the criminals that have chat rooms and message boards and forums and share information, they saw that ransomware people were getting a little more hip to what was going on, and they kind of went back to business email compromise. And when you look at the statistics, a 48% jump in business email compromise in 2018 alone. That year, the FBI estimated that business email compromise constituted almost 40%, 44% of the total cybercrime that happened last year. So very surprising, but very present. And if you go to the next slide, we'll sort of give you an example of what, as it is actually executed, a business email compromise might look like. This is an email that comes to your organization. If you have vendors, if you are doing, this is the classic example, if you have vendors that are doing, you have accounts payable, the vendor contacts you usually on a Friday, and we'll explain why in a minute, but it contacts you and they say, there's been a change in our banking framework. The account that you have been paying our invoices to has changed. Instead, we're going to ask that you send this payment to a different bank. A lot of the time, they mention that there's been a tax issue, and so we will send you this additional instructions about where to wire this money. Looks very legit. It can come from somebody that your organization has been working with for years. It can come from a address that has the very same domain name as the vendor that you've been working with. But this is sort of the example of what you might see. And now Anish will talk a little bit about what actually happens after that.
Sure. So the classic business email compromise scheme is targeted to an organization that performs wire transfers or transfers funds, which is going to be a very large number of organizations that have vendors or accept payments or send payments. So it's much more sophisticated than the previous Nigerian prince scheme. What they'll do is they'll compromise the vendor network, or even they'll compromise your internal network and send a convincing email that looks like it comes from the vendor or looks like it comes from someone in your own organization. Before doing that, though, they'll conduct social media harvesting. They'll look into all the information that they can find in terms of events that you're having and other information that they might be able to find in order to make sure that that email is convincing and it's referring to the actual tax authority, and it's something that you might expect to receive from that vendor based on the other emails that they can see going back and forth between you and that person. So once they send that email, it'll request a transfer to a new account or a change in account details that they'd like you to make. And then at that point, once the funds are transferred, they'll transfer them out and move them to an account where you can no longer get them back. Generally, the reason this happens on Friday is because there's a 72-hour period of time during which banks can retract that transfer. And if doing it on Friday means that if they distract you on Monday or if other things come up, it's very difficult to undo that transfer within that period of time. And of course, it's not something that people like to think about on the weekend. So in general, the strategy is just to make it look like business as usual so that people that are generally pretty sophisticated fall for this kind of thing, even though, of course, they would never send money to a Nigerian prince. So to give you an example of one case study, this was something that happened relatively recently. One nonprofit's executive director received such an email from what looked like a colleague that he'd worked with before. And at that time, the colleague asked for a transfer of $28,000 to a different bank account. And even though it was a new bank account, of course, because there was enough detail in the email and because the executive director was busy and trusted this colleague, he approved this transfer. The reason we know about this is because the bank actually took the unusual step of performing out-of-bound authentication, meaning they contacted someone by phone that they already knew was authorized and associated with the nonprofit. And as a result, that person could say, we didn't ask for this transfer. That wasn't my email. And the bank was able to stop the transfer. But that is actually an unusual practice, which is why the bank advertised it on its website. A lot of events like this don't become publicized, and once the executive director of the nonprofit approves the transfer, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get it back. So I've included my favorite New Yorker cartoon here because I think it's relevant here to make sure that your employees and your banks care whether or not the person requesting the transfer is a tape dispenser. They need to make sure that they're checking for out-of-band authorization and making sure that they go use methods other than email, which can be spoofed, to confirm that the account details are correct.
We have a question. Do you have any additional suggestions for the risk of transferring funds through multiple corresponding banks when you're funding programs overseas? If you're getting emails from these banks that are overseas, are there other thoughts or suggestions for how to go about verifying with them?
Yeah, sure. And we'll cover, so we have actually set aside some time to talk about best practices, but the bottom line is any kind of multiple factor authentication you can implement into your processing is going to benefit you. And one of the things that we want to make sure we emphasize is there's a reasonableness component to all this. Your companies can't put an iron box around their entity and sort of close down all business. And we recognize that some of these things, some companies operate very quickly. They need to be nimble in terms of what their business model is. Seems to me, and I could be wrong, that nonprofits, there may be a little bit less need to act so quickly on the spot, that there might be some ability to bake into the process controls, multiple factor authentication, verification of requests, especially when something looks off. And that's the key. The examples that Anish was just talking about, the example from that email is when the email that we were talking about earlier, when something comes in and asks to change the process that already has been in place, that should be a immediate red flag that mandates that somebody do additional verification work to prevent the fact that it is likely or a possibility that instruction is fraudulent. Do you have any further thoughts on that, Anish?
I think that's a good point. And another point is actually in both of the examples that we talked about, if the executive director or if you looked at the email in the previous slide closely, there are actually some typos and some inconsistencies, not the kind of thing you might notice if you weren't looking out for it, but this is just a sign that grammar nerds rejoice. It is important to pay attention to this kind of thing, because if the executive director had noticed the typos in the spoofed email, maybe he would have called his colleague and not made the transfer.
Yeah, if we go back to the email, the example that we had, these are, you can actually find this email on the web because it's been replicated and used so many times. But what you'll see is that the email says that they're having a problem with tax authority, right? So that should be a flag to you that something is a little bit off. But the point that I think we ought to suggest to you today is, we just having come from law enforcement and still spending some time with FBI and Secret Service and asking them what they're seeing, the criminals are getting better. These are in the 10 years ago, you would have individuals who are working by themselves, kind of pulling this stuff together. They may be less sophisticated. Today, the world of business email compromise is a syndicate type of organized activity. And you have people that are paid to spend the time, and we'll talk, if you can go to the next slide, about the business email compromise variations. They are working 24/7 to put together sophisticated operations. Where Anish was talking about the use of social media harvesting, another point. The emails that come in are not going to simply be, this CEO is stranded at the airport in Denver and needs to have money wired to pay for an expensive plane ticket, or the CEO is in a meeting and they need to have a contract approved, so send the money right away. Those are classics. What will happen now is that it's going to be that the CEO writes to whoever it is and says, hey, I hope your son's soccer game was a success this weekend, because they know from your Facebook account that you were at, that whoever it was at a soccer tournament this weekend. Or if it's a nonprofit and there's a event that's taking place, they're going to know that the event is taking place. They're going to reference it. They're going to talk potentially about speakers that were there. It's going to look much more legit, and that's the problem, than it used to 5 to 10 years ago. So when you look at these different types of schemes, really we could put 15 to 20 different slides together today to talk about all the different flavors of business email compromise schemes, because they know that they need to vary. They know that they need to come up with something new, and the old romance schemes and the fact that the CEO or the chief financial officer is not available at the moment. And again, if you do have a CFO and that CFO is unavailable and says they need to wire money, that ought to be a flag to you still in today's world that is likely not legit. And the one thing also to just mention again what Anush said about the Friday, that's still the case. There's still plenty that's taking place on Friday. And the reason it takes place on Friday is because, like Anush said, there's a 72-hour kill switch that law enforcement can invoke in a fraud situation. And banks are actually getting better at this, sort of flagging it through their internal analytics on their own. But they'll do the initial reach out on Friday, get the money transferred on Friday, with the hope that on Monday there may be another email followed up that says, just checking in, making sure that something to delay it even further to get to the afternoon, so that they hope that the 72 hours will elapse. If you do get one of these, if you find yourself in one of these situations, calling law enforcement immediately and having, because Secret Service, FBI can put into the system the kill switch to have that transaction reversed. And the good news is that a lot of the foreign countries that have been where the bank accounts are located are a little more sophisticated about this too. And so they are actually holding on to money beyond the 72 hours. So there's a little bit more of a grace period. But again, these are some of the patterns that you may encounter. We're going to talk real quickly about another example, just as a case study, with business email compromise with one organization that was unfortunately the victim of a scheme where, in this one, you had hackers that actually broke into the system, the environment of the organization itself. Sometimes the hack will be in the vendor's system, and so the activity will take place in their environment. The email comes in and looks legit. This one, the criminals were in the organization's environment itself, got into the email, posed as the employee, created false invoices and other documents, and tried to fool the charity into sending about $1 million to a fraudulent entity in Japan. And interestingly, just as we were talking about, there was a narrative to explain why this large amount of money needed to be transferred, relating to solar panels for health centers in Pakistan. And of course, this organization had been in Pakistan for more than 30 years and had activities and programs that were there. So again, it dovetailed right into what the organization was doing. The theft was discovered in 2017. The only reason Anush and I know about it is because it was reported in a IRS filing that they had to report. And so again, one of the lessons here is this is happening probably a lot more frequently than we know about. It's just because a lot of times organizations do not, and I think probably justifiably, do not report it publicly. But that's again an example of one of these schemes taking place in real world, and how expensive and how costly it can be.
I think let's move on to
we'll move on. So yeah, we've already talked about it, and just a point to make again about social media harvesting. If we're talking about best practices, what you might be able to do to minimize the risk that your organization is facing. Criminals are spending a lot of time looking at social media platforms in order to obtain the information that they need for these schemes, and we've talked about how it actually manifests itself. It does create kind of a challenge for organizations like yours, because I'm sure that if you're hosting an event, a fundraiser, things like that, you need to have an active social media presence. You need to be out there where people can connect with your organization, know what your organization's doing. Sometimes it's very helpful to have a personal relationship with your executives, with your executive director, with your people in fundraising. Just keep in mind, as you are trying to build in also whatever safeguards you can to protect yourself from fraud, that a lot of this information is useful and is being used as part of the fraud schemes themselves. So I think now we will talk a little bit about, again, some of the ways that your organizations can take steps to deter and minimize the risks that you face from these schemes. And we'll let Anish start off.
Sure. So some specific things you can do to reduce cyber risk. Now that John's ruined social media for you, and I've emphasized the importance of paying attention to grammar, there are a few other things you can do. And I don't mean this to say, if an email is perfectly formatted or if something wasn't on Facebook, it's definitely safe. In fact, you should have a policy, like John mentioned, that if there is a change in account information, would always do an external verification. Usually this would go in your accounting and auditing controls. So you wouldn't want to conduct that verification through email. You'd want to have a contact that you would call just in order to confirm that this change is something that's been authorized. Ideally, you would conduct due diligence on vendors when you bring them in, and you would also have a place where you have a written down contact for vendors before you get that urgent email that includes a name and a phone number that you can call just to verify when a vendor sends you an urgent request. And this is something that you have to think about in terms of the way your organization works and your needs. Consider the circumstances where you will need to make a transfer within 48 hours or 24 hours and make sure that there's someone who is available to pick up the phone then. If you don't need to transfer money that quickly, then create a mandatory waiting period. Make sure that you can't make those decisions too quickly and do something that you regret and then end up having to waste resources fixing later. Another policy that you should have is access control. Make sure that your employees know that they shouldn't be sharing passwords, they shouldn't be writing down their passwords and sticking them with a post-it note to their monitor. They also should be using complex passwords, and they should resist the strong temptation to change their passwords by adding 1 to a number and just changing from complex password 1 to complex password 2. John and I had a case where that was one of our clients got hacked. The employee changed his password, added 1 to the number, and the company got hacked again.
Yeah, bless his heart. That's sort of unfortunate and ubiquitous with people with their passwords.
Yes, don't do that. And diligence your vendors. Make sure that they also have access controls and are following the same procedures. And ensure that you're using discretion when posting on social media, or at least your employees know that just because somebody knows to wish your son a happy birthday, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should go outside of the procedure, even if their email has the tone of "this is very urgent." So some additional deterrence and prevention steps, not to ruin your holidays for you, but holidays, or particularly when you're a CEO or when your CFO is traveling or on vacation, is when you should be particularly vigilant, because if that's something that cyber criminals know, then they can use that information in order to tell you that the CEO or CFO urgently needs money. So make sure that that's something that's in your training materials. If you can't walk down the hall and check with the person in charge, make sure that there's a phone number you can reach or somebody else that he's delegated authority to in the event that something like this comes up. Make sure you make periodic public service announcements and make training materials available. There's a fair number of private sector training materials that are available to conduct phishing tests. KnowBe4 is one vendor that has some decent training materials, but they're usually things you can find. According to last year's Oracle report, human error is the top cyber risk according to board level executives. So this is actually good news because human error is really something that you can train for, and it doesn't require expensive licensing fees. You can send fake phishing emails to your employees, see who clicks on the link, and then talk to those employees specifically and provide them with some additional training, because once an attacker has insight into your network and access to an employee's email, it's obviously much easier to make convincing business email compromise work. As we've discussed, you should question variations to typical business practices. And one other thing that you might not have thought about is insurance for cyber and for fraud in general. The reason Save the Children didn't end up losing $1 million that was actually stolen, they only lost about 100,000, was because they had an insurance policy. So first you should check your existing policies to see if you have coverage for crime or for fraud, which could cover something like this. And if you have a lot of personal information, such as donors' social security numbers or financial information, then you might consider a cyber insurance policy. Depending on the size of your organization and the nature of your organization, that might not be very expensive. And often those insurance policies come with some resources to reduce the chances of a data breach, such as training, such as a hotline that you can call if you suspect that something might be going wrong. And so that's something that is worth looking into if you have personal information that donors or other individuals are trusting you with.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize enough what Anush said about training. Again, no organization is going to be completely 100% 24 hours, 7 days a week safeguarded from fraud. You just can't do it. It's the same thing with cybersecurity. You can implement enough measures, enough processes, enough protocols that will slow your business down to where you can't operate anymore. You'll be safe, but you can't do business anymore. So there's got to be a reasonableness component to what processes and protections you put in place. Training your employees is one way where you can get a tremendous amount of bang for your buck. And for a small organization that has 20 employees, 30 employees, where you focus on the folks that are in the financial department that are actually handling the money. And the training doesn't have to be necessarily sophisticated. It can be 20 minutes, it can be 30 minutes. You can spend a little bit of time on the internet, pick out, like we've talked about today, some examples of the types of schemes that your employees may encounter. Tell them, give them some security that they will be supported if they engage in if they slow things down and engage in the secondary authorization. Make sure they know that they have the authority to do that they have your support. If another employee is saying, well, you got to send that check, we're gonna have a problem if you don't send that check. If they really think that there's a problem and they need to slow it down, give them the security to do that. And know that things like, when Anush was saying, two-factor authentication, if you get something that's odd and they need to check on it, not to do that by sending an email back to that same vendor, because the likelihood is that vendor's email system is compromised. So, hey, I'm sending it, I didn't send it to Cheryl, I was sending it to Nancy. But Nancy's email is likely just to be as compromised as Cheryl's, and so they're going to get an email back from Nancy to say, of course you're going to send the check to this new bank account. Pick up the phone and call and get a live person to validate that new transaction is what it says it is. So again, not to belabor the point, but these things can help you to minimize these chances. We did want to spend, I know our time's running short, we did want to spend a little bit of time just to make sure that we talk about non-sort of internet-based, non-cyber types of fraud schemes, because while I'm guessing as you're thinking about how your company or how your nonprofit does business, I would imagine that you are gravitating more and more to web-based type of activity, but there's still plenty that you're doing that is the old-fashioned person-to-person, document-to-document, vendor-to-vendor type of business activity, and there's still plenty of fraud associated with those things too. There's things where you would have vendors that provide you with fake invoices. They don't actually do the work. The old adage, I'm an old person, the old adage of the encyclopedia salesperson that doesn't give you the encyclopedias. There's plenty of things as creative as people want to be, where they can come to your company or interact with you in some way to try to defraud you of money, whether it's through fake services, fake providers, fake reimbursements, some kind of phony donation type of scheme if you're collecting donations. And the unfortunate one, which I'll spend a little bit of time on, which is your employees. And after spending 16 years as a prosecutor, I can tell you that you do need to trust your employees. You need to have an environment that is supportive, that is nurturing, especially in a nonprofit where you're potentially not paying people as much money as they might make in the private sector. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at the percentage of types of instances where companies or nonprofits have lost money, a substantial portion of them involve an employee who, for whatever reason, because of financial problems at home or drug addiction or whatever it is, decides that the easiest way for them to have access to resources is through the resources of your company. And so the ways that you can protect that, as much as you trust and value your employees, is to put in processes in place where you can, and I know that your big companies can put in all kinds of different controls and compliance plans, and smaller organizations may not have the resources to do that. But if you just, for example, put in a random process where you can audit your vendors occasionally, pick one that looks like it might be the highest risk, the biggest dollar ones, be random about it, and audit the vendors to make sure that whatever the vendor is doing, you're actually getting those services. Because that's the classic one where you have somebody who's got a relationship with someone on the outside, and they set up a system of phony invoices, and you're losing 30 grand a month or 30 grand every 6 months, whatever it is. You're losing money for things that you don't get, and it's going into the pockets of people that don't deserve it. So whatever processes that you have the time and resources to do, where you can check up, have an account, have your accountants do audits of your finances to make sure that everything's in place. Those things will pay dividends, and hopefully we can all cross our fingers and think the best of people that won't happen. But if it does, that the risk that you have is minimized. And then a final word about what to do if you have a situation where you think that there is a problem. And the options that you might have include, hopefully, you have a lawyer that you trust and that you can call, that you can bounce things off of. You can call law enforcement. And I think, as Anush and I were talking about it, one of the things that we encounter frequently is, who do I call first? Do I call the police officer or the FBI agent first? Do I call the lawyer first? And we're lawyers, and I think the default for us is, if you are able to afford it, call your lawyer first. There may be situations like we talked about earlier where time is of the essence, where you may have a need to act very quickly to try to get the money back. And in those circumstances, I do hope that you will call law enforcement, and that they will be very helpful to you in responding to you quickly and helping you as the victim of a potential fraud scheme. When you call law enforcement, generally law enforcement is going to ask you for information. And so, in a big company, if there's an internal investigation that's being conducted under privilege, and a lot of the fact finding is within the scope of the attorney-client privilege, sometimes it can be a little difficult to take some of those facts and pull them to where you can provide them to law enforcement. And it becomes a little bit of a complicated question. Things like some of the things we're talking about today, for a smaller organization where the response is not necessarily through an attorney-client privilege protected investigation, there may be less of a concern about that. And providing that information to law enforcement really can be the steps to getting a response, and potentially either canceling or collecting back some of the funds that may have been lost. So if hopefully you will be able to call your lawyer will be able to help and perhaps be the intermediary with law enforcement, but we also encourage you to call law enforcement as well.
I think that's right. I would say that you should consider whether you're more of a victim in the situation, or whether there is some argument that your policies or your employees were responsible for it. If you're the victim of fraud, then call law enforcement immediately. If you're the victim of a business email compromise, call law enforcement immediately. If it's an insider situation, or if it's a data breach, then you might consider investigating internally or calling your lawyer first, just to preserve your options.
We would not recommend confronting the employee. If you think that your employee has stolen money, or at least over a long period of time, call your lawyer first before you talk to the employee. As much as it may be a family-style environment, there are things that employee, if there is in fact a problem, that they can do that make it much more difficult to get the money back.
Right. And one last point on things you can do to hopefully prevent it. Another policy you can have in place is an expense policy that includes specific provisions for when you must submit expenses, for review of expenses by another party, including itemized receipts and documentation requirements, and make it clear that there will be disciplinary action for people who don't follow the expense policy. Sanctions that aren't necessarily getting fired right away, but various levels of disciplinary action. It actually just came out today, I think, that there was a former accountant at St. Luke's Foundation that made out checks payable to herself and ended up stealing $500,000 over the course of about 10 years. And she's now facing about 20 years in prison without parole. All of which is to say, this is something to think about on the front end and worry about, because you want to give your employees the tools they need to succeed and make sure that you have the proper work environment and are setting clear ethical boundaries from the top.
Yeah, and Anisha's example is a good one. I can tell you that I know there's probably some folks watching today that work for religious-based organizations, and your first thought is, well, we're a religious-based organization, or we're a faith-based group. We have faith. Our mission and our organization is steeped in this faith, and that's part of the ethos is not one where people are going to steal. And the unfortunate thing is that any organization is as much prone to theft and fraud as any other organization, and simply because your mission is a benevolent one, and you're serving the community, or you're steeped in the collective faith of the organization, unfortunately we've had plenty of instances where those groups are targeted as well. So as much as you would like to think that you may not be a victim, the real world manifests itself in every place. So I don't know if we have any other questions from the group, or
No, no other questions right now.
Okay, well, if you have any questions, you can always email us or call us. We'd be glad to help. And again, we want to thank the Pro Bono Partnership for all the service that they provide to so many deserving and impactful organizations in our community. So we'd like to share our thanks for that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for hosting us.
Good luck.